Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the Sharks 2021 draft class for this year. The Sharks ended up with 9 picks in this year's draft. Obviously, a team will normally start with 7, but because of some wheeling and dealing, the Sharks ended up with the 9 picks, though many of them coming late in the draft, so kind of shots in the dark, I guess you could say. The major pick to obviously talk about would be their first rounder, which ended up being 7th overall, thanks to the fact that the Sharks were quite bad this past season, and at 7th overall, they got potentially the steal of the draft with William Eklund picked there. He was a name that I had mentioned in my draft preview, but I had also said in that preview that it would have been a big surprise to see Eklund actually drop past the Red Wings at 6th overall, because many people not only, said Eklund was a top 5 talent at the draft. Not only did they say he could be a top 3 talent at the draft, but there were even some people, some analysts, some scouts who believed Eklund to be the best player in the 2021 draft. I mean, if he was just a couple of inches taller, many people felt that as though he could have been the first overall selection. But in the end, Owen Power gets that first overall selection from the Buffalo Sabres, and Eklund falls all the way to 7th for the Sharks to snag. And he could end up being a very, very not only strong NHL player, but potentially a strong NHL star in just a couple of years. Will he be able to play as soon as next season? It is technically possible, as of course the lack of competition in the Sharks bottom 6 could make it so Eklund could breeze through and make it to the Sharks roster. But is that something that the Sharks actually want to have happen? That is another question. It's very possible Eklund actually just returns to Sweden for this next season and comes to join the Sharks in a couple of years, where maybe he's a bit more ready to get some top 6 time, because obviously that's where he projects to end up being once he develops into a full-fledged NHL player. For their second pick, this did not come in the second round thanks to the Erik Karlsson trade a few years ago. Finally, that trade has fully run its course, and the Sharks will not be losing any more value from that, except if you count Erik Karlsson's contract, at which point the Sharks would be still losing a ton of value. But nevertheless, as we move on to the third round, the Sharks, they came in, they wanted to take their best player available, most likely at 7th overall, but they were also potentially looking for a solid goaltender, which is why some people, including myself, thought that they could potentially make a move for one of the 2 top goaltending prospects at this year's draft, Sebastian Cossa or Jesper Wallstedt, who both ended up, of course, going in the first round after the Sharks selection. In the end, the Sharks actually end up with the third-ranked goaltender at 81st overall with Benjamin Gaudreau. The reason why he actually ends up dropping so low, and I should note that when I say third-ranked, while Cossa and Wallstedt were kind of close and you could go between the two for first 2, Gaudreau is strictly in third place. The reason he finds himself relatively low in that regard is because he was in the OHL this season, and the OHL was one of the very few leagues that didn't actually return to play this past year. Both the WHL and the QMJHL, with the OHL, they make up the CHL. Those 2 leagues actually returned to play, but the OHL did not. And so the only few games that we actually got to see from Gaudreau this season were at the 2021 IIHF Under-18 World Championships, where he was the goaltender for Canada. And interestingly enough, he was actually named the best goaltender of the tournament in that World Championships, where he was extremely impressive. So this could potentially be a very solid third-round pick for the San Jose Sharks. Obviously, as a goaltender, he'll likely take a bit more time to develop, and so we shouldn't really expect him to be able to, come close to the Sharks roster within at least 3 or so years, but he does project to be a starting goaltender at the NHL level, and maybe he is a goaltender of the future for the San Jose Sharks. Now, as we move forward, we get to the 4th round and later, and of course, once you get even past like the 2nd round, you start to get into a lot of picks where you never really know what to expect. And so at the 4th round, you're kind of just hoping for the best in many situations. While a lot of people will say, but look at Joe Pavelski, he managed to score so many goals after being a 7th round pick in 2003. But then what they don't mention is the 100 other players who were picked between the 4th and 7th rounds of the entry draft who never so much as even sniff NHL ice. So these are, as I said earlier on, a shot in the dark. And at 103rd overall, the Sharks end up taking Guénon Larocque. He was in the WHL as a defenseman, played a ton of ice time for his WHL team, and was also named their top defenseman on their team. So he definitely has a lot of the aspects that you want to see out of a defender. He can play the big minutes, he can play the tough minutes, and so maybe that can be something that could be helpful for the San Jose Sharks in developing into a solid player over the next few years. Now, one of the most interesting things, as I mentioned earlier, is of course that once you get to these later picks, they are obviously much more gambly. But this year, it was even more so because of the fact that, as I said, the OHL didn't actually have any games this season, and usually the OHL is kind of a talent factory for the NHL entry draft. And so when it comes to these next three Sharks players drafted, Ethan Cardwell, Artem Guriev, as well as Max McHugh. These are three players who were in the OHL and as such did not actually get to play any junior games this season. A bit of an exception goes to Cardwell, as he did go overseas to play a bit in Sweden, but especially for the other two players, they did not get any games this year. And so these three players are a bit more of a gamble, and I actually enjoy that the Sharks actually made it. As I have said multiple times already in this video, you're already gambling when you're taking players in the fourth or later rounds, so you might as well take a gamble on these types of players who we really haven't gotten to see much progress from over this past year, because while it is obviously very possible and also quite likely that these players end up showing up in their draft plus 1 years and not looking particularly good and never actually make it to the NHL, it is also quite possible that they developed quite well even without consistent games over this past season, and they end up being, talents that you would have normally picked in a second or third round had you actually seen them play in their respective leagues this season. So I do enjoy the choices of Guriev as well as Max McHugh and even of Ethan Cardwell. Side note, Cardwell also somewhat well known for his co-host duties on a podcast about hockey in Canada, so I guess that's an interesting fact to take a look at. Then we move on to the 167th overall pick for the Sharks, and probably a pretty interesting one for a late round choice. This is Liam Gilmartin. He is a left winger, and he was actually, early prior to this draft predicted to be, potential third round player, maybe even late second round player. So it's interesting to see him drop all the way down to the 6th round. Did the Sharks maybe find a diamond in the rough here that all the other teams ended up neglecting? It's possible, but also maybe the other teams actually had a reason to let him drop this far down. In the end, Gilmartin, a pretty decent choice. The fact that he was ranked so high, you might as well, so high relative to where he actually ended up being picked, you might as well end up taking a chance there. Next, at 177th overall was Theo Jacobson, a player who played in Sweden this past year. Probably the most interesting thing about him was the fact that he played in 3 different leagues over this past year. At first, he was in the under-18 Swedish league, where he was extremely dominant. He then moved up to the under-20s, where he didn't really get a ton of ice time, but was still pretty good, and he would eventually move up to the second-tier Swedish league to finish off the year, where he would play just a few games. So it is good to see that he was a player who kind of impressed wherever he went, though again, as a 6th rounder, don't necessarily expect too many big things. And the round off the draft at 199th overall was Evgeny Kashnikov, a defender from, of course, Russia, as you could probably tell from the name. Again, a shot in the dark here at the 7th rounder. You don't necessarily expect him to make the Sharks roster in any capacity over these next few years, but you never really know, and you might as well make use of the pick. And so that will do it for this Sharks draft review. Obviously, the biggest name here is William Eklund, and he will, single-handedly make the Sharks prospect pool look significantly better than it did just a couple of days ago. But definitely keep an eye on as well Benjamin Goodrow. He could potentially be a goaltender that could be the goaltender of the future for the San Jose Sharks within these next few years. You never know. Class dismissed.